Hey, welcome back to another episode of the What's Your Grief podcast. This is Eleanor, and of course, I'm joined by Litsa. Litsa, how are you today?
I'm doing okay. I am cat sitting for a friend's very, very vocal cat. This cat makes more sounds than any cat I've ever been around before. So I share that both to say that's all I'm doing. I'm cat sitting. And
Okay.
also, if you hear any strange noises in the background, that's
Yeah.
probably what it is.
I've noticed that you cat sit a lot for somebody who's a dog person.
I've noticed that about myself too lately. I think that part of this is that my mom has had cats for a very long time, but her old cat, terribly allergic to.
Oh,
So I
right.
could not even go in the house. So I never cat sat. And then they got that cat died, and then they got a new cat. And their new cat, I'm allergic a little bit to all cats, but the question is, can you control it with medication or not? And the new cat I can control with medication. So I started cat sitting for my mom periodically. And then once a couple of friends knew I was cat sitting for my mom, it was like I was available on the market as a cat sitter. And so now suddenly I have been cat sitting a bit more regularly, but I dog sat last weekend. And that was much better because I am in fact a dog person,
Right.
and it
Not
was
allergic.
not allergic. And it was so nice to have like a big oafy dog in my house. I had him at my house, and yeah, I had a great
Yeah.
time. Lots of nice long walks. It was great.
We were just talking in the community about loneliness and how one of the things you can do if you are somebody who knows that you can take care of an animal is to adopt an animal. And that's always a nice solution for people who are animal people. Definitely not recommending it if you're not sure if you can take that on or if it's too much of a responsibility for you right now. But it can be a really nice thing. And it gets people out, like you said,
Yeah.
sometimes if they take the dog for a walk or things like that. So,
Oh yeah, after my dad died, my mom and my sister and I got a dog, and all of us look back often and talk about how amazing that was, like what a good thing that was for all of us in our grief.
mhm.
Gloria, she was great.
Oh,
And again, I think you don't want to do it impulsively, but if it's the right thing, it can be a really, really, really good thing
yeah,
after a loss.
agreed. Anyways, so off topic from what we were going to discuss today.
Yeah.
Uh, well, actually, on the subject of what we were going to discuss today, we had a long conversation, and we have a lot of different ideas that we tend to throw around. And once again, we're open to listener suggestions. If you ever have something you want us to talk about or a specific question, we won't tell people who asked it, but we encourage you to send it because we like to have specific questions to answer, but we didn't today. So we had a couple of things we were throwing around. And one of the things we were talking about is just going back and covering some of the content that we covered when we started this podcast back in 2015. If you think that our podcast is low budget now. In 2015, before everybody had a
I
podcast.
was going to say, I think it technically was even 2014 that
Was
our
it?
first,
Okay.
yeah. Yep.
And it was a lot, actually, believe it or not, harder to make a podcast. And it was very, very amateur hour. And if we're saying that now, you can only imagine. But anyways, we were talking about how it might be nice to go back and revisit some of those topics. And I think the second or the third topic we did was misconceptions about grief.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I don't know, like there's some things that we used to talk about in a certain way back in the day that have sort of evolved in a way. And I think one of the discussions we were having is how we don't really talk a lot about misconceptions about grief just because there are so many misconceptions about grief, right? And they really all could depend on the family you grew up in or the culture you grew up in or the society you grew up in or just attitudes that you sort of absorbed watching television or reading books, things like that. There's so many. And one of the best ways to kind of demystify and set the record straight is to actually instead talk about some of the things that are true about grief.
Yes. And I think that, oftentimes the things that are true, they point to sometimes a whole cluster of misconceptions that might be under that. Like when you go, oh, wait, if this is true, then a whole bunch of related misconceptions are not
Right.
true. But it sometimes seems like an easier way to think about it or to talk about it.
Right. And like, no shame if you feel like you went into grief with 100 misconceptions, because that is what everybody does. Because it's one of those experiences that you can't fully know until you're in it. And we, a while back, asked people, like, what do you wish you had known about grief? What are some of the things you wish you had known about grief going in? And we received so many responses, and we've created list upon list about this. I think we have 2 or 3 different lists that are called 64 things I wish I had known about grief, or I wish somebody told me about grief, because we just received so many different answers. And I think that just goes to show that there are so many surprises in store when somebody goes into grief. Not great surprises, but surprises nonetheless. And we were just talking about it where we are in our grief now, which is, we've experienced many different types of losses, but I think the one that we kind of always think about is the death of, both of us experienced the death of a parent in early adulthood, which we're both now over a decade out from. But we were just talking about, like, what is like one thing that's surprising you now, all this time later, about your loss and about grief?
Yeah. So, and it's interesting. I think there's a lot of things still that I don't know that they're all like fresh surprises, but maybe I continue to be reminded of them as surprises. I think the first one is probably just like the simplest one. Like for me, it's been more than 2 decades since my dad died. I was 18 when my dad died. And I think that at that time, it's interesting. One of the things that I think we say is a misconception, or we often talk about, is this idea that you'll grieve in some way forever, that people don't, it's a misconception that it ends, or that it's time limited, or that it has an expiration date. But when I look back on myself at the time, I'm not sure that was a misconception for me. Like, it was such a big, devastating thing in my life that I think I very much was like, this is going to be with me forever. Like, I didn't have some idea that it was going to go away, or that it was, I don't remember ever feeling that. I remember feeling like this has permanently changed everything. And so I think now the thing that's interesting as I'm 20 years out is how much that remains true, but feels very different in how it's true. Like, I think now when I look at my grief, I do think that loss changed everything about the trajectory of my life. Like, I think it would have been incredibly different for a lot of significant reasons. I was 18, so I was still in the middle of like making a lot of big decisions about my life. And I do still think now, like, having the worldview that was shaped by being a person who lost a parent at 18, I very much live my life in this way of like, who knows how long you have. I'm probably going to die pretty soon. And that like shapes a lot of what I do. But I think that the specifics of grief, or the specifics of feeling like I'm grieving my dad as a person, has changed a lot. And I think that in a way that's, hard, would have surprised me. Like, I think that now it's been so long that there's so many specific things about my dad that I still, miss and grieve, but that in general, it feels more conceptual, which I don't know. I don't think I would have liked to have heard that 20 years ago.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. And by conceptual, do you mean is it a similar meaning to like abstract in a way?
Yeah, like abstract, like now it's just so much a part.
Yeah.
Like it's just so much a part of my world. Like my world foundationally is a world that exists without my dad. It has been a world that exists without my dad for so long that that now feels familiar. Like it feels the absence of my dad feels familiar.
Yeah.
Whereas I think I 20 years ago would have said that's impossible. It will not ever be possible for that to feel familiar. It still feels awful. Like if familiar, I think doesn't mean it, it feels good. I think it just means I don't, that early grief sort of, and when I say early, I mean like first decade grief of sort of everything feeling like it was compared to the world where my dad was still here. I think I feel that less now because I'm just used to a world where he doesn't exist.
I think my answer would be in the same category as your answer. So, and when we talk about like in our book, the first chapter we wrote, or the first section we wrote, was like truths about grief. And the way we talked about it there, because people were finding this book theoretically in the very beginning of their grief, is just that it's not a predictable process with a set timeline and an endpoint, right? Which is to say, it ebbs, it flows, and it goes on. And I think I'm in, which is kind of where I think I would put what you just said. And it's also where I would put what is feeling most prominent for me lately, is that my grief is still with me. And I am often surprised at the space it occupies, because it doesn't just like settle in and stay the same. And I think when people hear us say like grief will stay with you, they think a lot of different things. Initially, they might think it's always going to feel like this bad first 6 months, year, 2 years. And that's not what we mean. But I also don't necessarily think we mean that it's going to like find a space and stay there. Like it kind of evolves in this interesting way. Like I kind of, in my head, I think about it. It's like if you planted a seed on the day your loved one died, like a tree. If you planted a tree on the day your loved one died, and it started to grow, like it would grow up, it would grow out, it would grow all these different branches, and every season it would look different. And that's kind of how I'm feeling. Like, because now I feel like I felt like I was very much in that abstract place. And like a couple months ago, that was something I was really actually grieving a lot, because I felt like it was a symbolic of me losing the tangibles of my mom, which I've lost, those sensory things a long time ago.
Yeah.
But really just not even being able to like remember what her voice sounded like, things like that. I was really grieving that. And now I feel like it's evolved into something different, but similar, where I really find that I'm in a way I haven't been for a long time, just like yearning to have her back again.
Yeah.
It's odd. I feel like I've kind of gone back to where I was in the beginning in a different way. And it's like just hard for me to describe, but I just feel like I'm more and more revisiting this idea that she's never coming back, and that's not fair. Yes. And like, I just wish to have her back. And I hadn't felt like that probably for years and years. I don't know what's bringing me to this new place of like non-acceptance of it, or like kind of feeling that it's unfair. Maybe it is where I am in my life as a mother, or what, I have no idea, but like.
Yeah. Oh, I think that's very true. And I think I've been thinking about something similar recently, because my mom had been having some health stuff. And for whatever reason, that one of the things that you would think that like maybe that would bring up stuff more specifically related to my mom dying, or, like those sorts of things. But what it really brought up was me thinking about my dad. Like, how would this be different if my dad were here? And I hadn't done that in a while, where I'd had like a really specific thing where I was like, oh, wait a minute, this would feel really different. Like this whole thing would be really different. And so I had that same feeling where I was like, wow, I haven't had this kind of grief feeling in a while. And when it came up, it felt like a feeling from another time. But again, I feel like it is because it always ebbs and flows.
Yeah. Yeah. And like when I talk about like the metaphor of of a tree, sorry, that sounds cheesy, but I like metaphors. So I will use them.
So I will lean into it.
It's not that all the branches are like bad or broken, it's just that like some are, and some are great. Some bear fruit, some have flowers, some are wonderful, representative of like the continued bond and the space that the person that the people, you love continue to occupy in your life. But some are a little darker and twisty and bent and broken. And I don't know, sometimes I'm surprised when one really feels kind of really bad, because you do, after a certain amount of time, just sort of feel like I've made peace, and I'm making more peace every day, more peace, more peace, more peace. And when you hit a place where you're like, oh, whoa, like I actually haven't made peace with all of this. And it's not that on day, one, I didn't start to make peace with all the things I needed to make peace with. Like, I think that's also a myth out there that like, well, if you do your grief right, you'll like make closure with all these things.
Sure.
And it's like, no, that's not it. Because as you get older, like all these new losses, all these secondary losses, like they crop up. They come out of nowhere. They didn't exist on day one. Like they weren't in your consciousness. They weren't there. They grew over time. And so I think people who feel like, oh, well, I can grieve my way through this and come to a place of acceptance and peace. Well, maybe that's how you feel. Like, and if that's how you feel, then okay. But I think for a lot of people, it's like, oh, wait a minute. This is like something that continues to crop up in new ways that I could never have made peace with because it didn't exist.
Oh yeah, because it didn't exist and because it wouldn't. And I think that for me, and maybe this idea of it feeling more abstract or interesting, or I don't know, abstract feels like the wrong word too, but I think to me, some of the like life path trajectories, I feel very aware of how like certain paths in my life very distinctly happened because of my dad's death. And so as a result, like I truly early in my grief, I think never could have predicted, there was just no way, right? You can never predict the future of your life, but there are so many things that you can't, you look back and you think, God, wow, I never could have imagined this, and that this would bring up so many new feelings about my loss or so many new feelings about the past, even though it's, 10, 15, 20, 25 years later.
Yeah. And so that kind of goes along with another thing that I'm noticing as I get older, because you bring these losses with you, many of them, and they become a part of your story. And many of them you do find peace with, many of them you do find ways to cope with and live alongside them. There is sort of this cumulative effect. And I do feel like now more than ever, I feel like, wow, we live alongside so much loss as we get older. And like, I hear it when we meet with people in the community and they share their story. Like a lot of people aren't just coming to say, I'm grieving this one person. They are naming many losses that they have experienced. And so it is something that I didn't realize necessarily. Like I realized it, but I guess I'm living it, that a lot of losses, like they stick with you and they begin to add up a little bit.
Yeah. And I've been thinking about this too, because I've been thinking about sort of the implications of intergenerational loss and how, our own grief, I think in ways starts with our parents and our caregivers and their grief, and what we were raised with. And I was thinking recently about my mom or really about both my parents, but my mom specifically, having had so many losses that she went through well before my dad died. I mean, her dad died when she was in elementary school, and then she and my dad had a baby that was stillborn when I was 4, but her best friend died when she was 36 or one of her very closest friends died of breast cancer, and sort of a really upsetting, the whole thing was like a really upsetting death specifically. And then there were other, like, those were some of the big ones. But I was just thinking about how, like, even from my childhood, like, those losses were so much a part of my mom's life, and therefore, and I knew about those, and therefore they were kind of part of my life. And I do think as I get older now, you do just start to realize, well, yeah, because that's what life becomes, right? It becomes loss on top of loss on top of
And
loss.
I don't think people, I mean, I guess maybe I didn't realize, I mean, I did and I didn't, but like that, this sounds so dark and depressing. It's not, but that living life, like eventually you reach a point where you just have to live alongside loss. Do you know what I mean? Like, I feel like there's this misconception that we have a loss and we shed it and we move forward from it. And that's not really fully true.
Yeah.
Eventually we reach a point where we just have to say, I've this loss is all a part of my story, and I have to find a way to live a life of value and meaning and purpose at the same time. Does that make sense? I feel like I'm not making a lot of sense today.
No, I think it does make sense. And I think that, I'm thinking about that New York Times essay a couple weeks ago, that was called More and More I Talk to the Dead.
Mm-hmm.
And, the author of that very much, I think, talks about this idea. Like, there's an image at one point that she sort of uses of the idea of kind of sitting around like a table.
Yeah.
With people lost, and thinking about that. And I think it really is part of what we have to figure out a way to become comfortable. I mean, maybe comfortable is the wrong word, but I think comfortable with, of like that reality of being able to make that part of it, of us. And I look at my friends who've gone through some of them many multiple losses, and how much, because I think we have maybe more of a comfort with grief and talking about grief, and that being, like, I think of how much conversation happens around people who are dead. And like, I think that's able to happen because there's never that feeling of like, oh, I can't bring this up, that's going to make somebody else uncomfortable, or I can't think that, like, it comes up easily in conversation all the time, both the grief, but also just the people who are gone. And it makes me great. I'm grateful that I have that with people, but it also makes me aware of how hard and sad it would be to not have that. And I know that many people don't have that. Like, I'm uniquely lucky in so many ways to have that, but it's not that like comfort and that idea of like, we're all gonna be living alongside of it all the time. So we just need to learn how to all make space for it together.
Yeah.
I don't think is the default for us culturally.
No, not in our culture, at least not in our society. But you're right. I mean, if you're not willing to acknowledge and talk about and acknowledge its presence, it's like you're tiptoeing around a lot of unmentionable things. So, yeah. But there are a lot of truths about grief, I think, that we can talk about and that we will talk about in time.
Another day.
But I think the fact that you and I both had very similar answers about what's surprising us, I think maybe goes to show that this one about the timeline, the myth of the timeline, and the myth of the uniformity or the progression of it is one that is really just big for people and needs to be kind of revised. We talk all the time about what the evolving relationship with grief means, and I don't know, I just don't think people realize it. And if you realize it going in, then like, good. I'm sure people do. I'm sure people have learned different lessons about grief than I did, growing up, because I didn't learn a lot of lessons about grief until I was in it. But I do think a lot of people do go into grief thinking it's going to look a certain way over time, and the way it unfolds is just totally different.
Yes. And it would be interesting to sort of talk to people early, like really early, and be like, what do you think this is going to look like? Because one of the things that's so hard is I go back and I'm like, this is what I think I thought, and this is what but it's so hard to say. And even the more recent losses like that I've had during COVID, like it's hard now because I'm somebody who spent so much time thinking about grief that it's not that useful to think about what I think, but it would be really interesting. Like I would love to see a big qualitative research study, not where they prompted people, but where they just asked people unprompted in like the first month after someone died, like, what do you think this is going to look like over from here on out? I would love to know what people's answers are.
And what people a decade out then say.
Yeah.
I think that we know that we don't know what it's going to look like, right? So I would not at all be surprised if data showed it did not follow the expected pattern that I thought it would. And you're right. You and I working in this space, we're primed to see it. Like I think I am primed to see it in my life more than someone else might. I do think it's present of mind for a lot of people, regardless. Like I'm not saying people aren't noticing. I'm just saying like I think maybe I'm more apt to label a lot of things about my grief that someone else might label as something different.
Yeah,
but
that's so true.
I don't know. It's all, I don't have answers. I just have questions and thoughts.
Yeah, I'm with you. So we will talk more about other truths in future episodes.
Yeah, we'll definitely do that. Once again, if you have a suggestion or a question, you can email us at whatsyourgrief@gmail.com, or you can reach out to us on mostly Instagram. You could tweet at us at What's Your Grief. We're also on Facebook, Pinterest. We're a lot of places, but we're in conversation mostly on Instagram. And we'll link to some other things in the show notes. Our book that does talk more specifically about truths about grief and myths and misconceptions, and also our community. We have a community for people who are grieving, and we have a community for grief professionals. When we say community, we mean it's like a kind of like a private membership only type of community where we do a lot of different types of things. So we'll provide information about that. And I guess that's everything, right?
I think that's it.
All right.